In the heart of 16th century France, a storm was gathering, not of thunder or rain, but of faith, ambition, and blood. France was a kingdom divided, not just by politics, but by belief. On one side stood the Catholics, guardians of tradition, fiercely loyal to Rome and the Pope. To them, the Catholic faith was not just a spiritual matter, but the bedrock of French identity, intertwined with the monarchy, with national pride, and with divine order itself. On the other side stood the Huguenots, French Protestants, inspired by the uncompromising teachings of John Calvin. They demanded religious reform, freedom of worship, and recognition in a kingdom that viewed them with suspicion and often hatred. For decades, tension simmered just below the surface. Protestantism spread quickly, especially among nobles, merchants, and urban elites, while Catholicism remained entrenched in the countryside, among conservative nobles and common folk alike. Noble houses themselves split along religious lines, turning old family rivalries into bitter, often bloody feuds. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Pamphlets circulated, sermons raged, alliances shifted. France was a powder keg. It only needed a spark. That spark came in 1559, in a tragic accident. King Henry II, a strong Catholic monarch, was killed during a jousting tournament. His opponent's lance shattered, piercing the king through the eye. He died days later, leaving the throne to his 15-year-old son. Francis II, a sickly, inexperienced boy, power now rested in the hands of competing factions. The Catholic Guy's family, one of the most powerful noble houses in Europe, quickly moved to control the young king and dominate the royal court. Opposing them were the Bourbons, Protestant-leaning nobles led by young Henry of Navarre, who, though not yet king, would one day play a central role in France's fate. At first, the conflict played out in court politics and local tensions, but in 1562, a single brutal event pushed the kingdom into a loud civil war. In the small town of Vassy, the Duke of Guise's men attacked a Protestant congregation at worship. Dozens were slaughtered. Men, women, children, none were spared. Word spread like wildfire, and with it came fury, outrage, and rebellion. Within weeks, France was plunged into the first of 8 brutal civil wars that would tear the kingdom apart for nearly 4 decades. The French wars of religion had begun. The devastation was immense. Protestant militias seized cities and towns, fortifying them against Catholic assault. Catholic armies swept through the countryside, determined to crush the so-called heretics. Churches were looted, sacred relics smashed, stained glass shattered, and altars desecrated. Priests were murdered at the altar. Protestant pastors were dragged from pulpits and hanged. This was not just a war of soldiers and banners. It was a war of neighbors, communities split down the middle. Friends and family members turned against one another. Entire villages were engulfed in violence, not because of foreign invaders, but because of hatred that had taken root at home. At the center of this storm stood Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother, an Italian noblewoman and widow of Henry II. Catherine was a masterful political survivor. She ruled from behind the scenes, navigating the dangerous currents of the French court. Trying desperately to keep the Valois dynasty afloat, she issued edicts of religious tolerance, hoping to cool the fires of fanaticism. She arranged marriages between Catholic and Protestant nobles, hoping to bind the warring factions together. She played her enemies against one another, keeping the court balanced on the knife's edge. But every attempt at peace crumbled. Each truce was short-lived, broken by betrayal, ambition, or vengeance. The hatreds ran too deep. The thirst for power was too great. By the late 1560s, France was a scarred and bleeding land. Its fields were ravaged, its towns battle-worn, its people exhausted and terrified. But despite Catherine's efforts, despite temporary peace treaties and desperate negotiations, the worst was still to come, for looming on the horizon was the most infamous night in French religious history, a night that would stain the streets of Paris with blood, shatter any hope of reconciliation, and change the course of the kingdom forever. August 1572. Paris was a city poised between celebration and tension. For years, France had been locked in brutal conflict between Catholics and Huguenots. The country was exhausted, its fields scorched by armies, its towns scarred by battles, its people ground down by fear. Yet now there was a flicker of hope. A royal wedding had been arranged. Henry of Navarre, the Protestant leader of the Bourbon family, was set to marry Margaret of Valois, sister of the Catholic King Charles IX. This was no ordinary marriage. It was meant to be a political masterstroke, a union that would heal the kingdom, bind the rival factions, and bring peace at last. In the days leading up to the wedding, Protestant leaders flooded into Paris. Cautious but optimistic, they came to attend the celebration and negotiate the fragile peace. Among them were prominent Huguenot nobles, trusted advisors, and even military commanders. The mood was tense but hopeful. But behind the palace walls, darker currents were at work. Hardline Catholic nobles, furious at the thought of a Protestant so close to the throne, whispered into the ear of King Charles. Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother and ever the political chess master, feared Protestant influence over her son. What began as suspicion twisted into conspiracy. On the night of August 23rd, the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang. Out across Paris, and hell was unleashed. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre had begun. In the dead of night, Catholic militias stormed the homes of Huguenots. They dragged men, women, and children from their beds and butchered them in the streets. Bodies piled in alleyways. Blood ran through the gutters and into the Seine. Prominent Protestant leaders were targeted first. Among them, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a key Huguenot figure, shot, stabbed, mutilated, and thrown from a window. But soon the violence spread beyond the nobility. Ordinary Catholics, stirred into a frenzy, joined the slaughter. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Old grudges resurfaced. For days, the killing raged. The rivers of Paris ran red, and it did not stop there. The massacre spread like a plague across France. In Lyon, Rouen, Orleans, and Bordeaux, similar waves of violence erupted. Across the kingdom, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Protestants were killed, some say even more. Henry of Navarre himself barely escaped. Forced to renounce his faith publicly, he was kept under watch at court, biding his time until he could flee and rejoin the Protestant cause. But the dream of peace was shattered. The massacre sent shockwaves through Europe to Catholics. Some saw it as a triumph of faith, the purging of heresy. Others recoiled at the horror, uneasy with the depths of the violence. To Protestants across the continent, it was a nightmare, proof of Catholic treachery, cruelty, and the impossibility of coexistence toward France, already broken, sank deeper into civil war. The next 2 decades were a brutal, grinding conflict. Towns were taken, lost, and retaken. Armies clashed across scorched fields. Fortresses rose, and famine followed in their wake. Families fled or simply disappeared into the chaos. And amid the rubble emerged three men, locked in a deadly triangle. The War of the Three Henrys had begun. Henry III, the Catholic king, struggling to hold his kingdom together. Henry of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, ambitious and charismatic, commanding an army of Catholic hardliners. And Henry of Navarre, Protestant prince, soldier, and heir to the throne by blood. Their rivalry would shake France to its core in this final chapter of the wars of religion. Betrayal became routine. Assassinations followed alliances. Henry of Guise was murdered in 1588, stabbed in the king's own chambers. Months later, King Henry III himself was assassinated by a fanatical monk, leaving only one Henry standing. Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, a warrior, and, by law, the next king of France. But could a Protestant sit on the French throne? Could a nation torn by decades of religious hatred accept such a king? Henry knew what was at stake, and so he made a decision that would change history. Henry of Navarre stood at a crossroads, a Protestant by faith, a king by blood, and a man facing a kingdom torn apart by decades of war. For over 30 years, France had been ravaged by religious violence. 8 civil wars had left towns in ruins, fields scorched, and families divided forever. Protestant and Catholic alike were exhausted, their people weary of bloodshed and desperate for stability. Henry understood one hard truth: if France was to survive, something had to give. In 1593, he made a decision that shocked his allies and stunned his enemies. He converted. Paris is worth a mass. These were the words attributed to Henry as he abandoned his Protestant faith and embraced Catholicism, the religion of the majority. To claim the French throne, to some, it was betrayal. To others, it was pragmatism. But to all, it was the act that changed the course of the nation. In 1594, Henry was crowned King Henry IV of France, ushering in a period of cautious optimism. But Henry knew that a crown and a conversion were not enough to heal a country so deeply wounded. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, one of the most remarkable documents of its time. The edict granted Protestants, for the first time in French history, the legal right to worship in certain areas, hold public office, and fortify towns for self-defense. It marked the first formal attempt at religious coexistence in a nation that had known only persecution and war. For the ordinary people of France, it brought a chance to breathe again. The wars were over. The bloodshed had stopped. Families who had fled their homes began to return. Markets reopened. Churches, Catholic and Protestant, began to heal. Henry's reign became known for his efforts to rebuild. He focused on improving agriculture, stabilizing the economy, and repairing the fractured social fabric of the nation. But peace is never simple. Though the Edict of Nantes brought legal recognition, it was a delicate balance. Many Catholics resented the concessions. Many Protestants feared the promises would not hold. And some extremists on both sides saw Henry as either a traitor or a false convert. In 1610, after years of hard-won progress, Henry IV was assassinated by Francois Ravin, a Catholic fanatic who saw him as a danger to the faith. The shock was immediate. The nation mourned a king who, despite his compromises, had brought a weary country back from the brink. With Henry gone, the future of Protestant rights grew uncertain. His son, Louis XIII, was only 8 years old, and the kingdom was soon dominated by powerful advisers, chief among them Cardinal Richelieu. Under Richelieu's hand, the monarchy tightened its grip, centralizing authority, weakening the nobility, and gradually eroding the protections Protestants had won under the Edict of Nantes. At the peace that Henry IV had fought to create began to fray. Protestant strongholds were dismantled, military rights were stripped away, and though religious toleration officially remained, the slow squeeze of Catholic dominance left the Huguenot community increasingly isolated. This was the France that emerged from the wars of religion, a nation battered by conflict, bound by uneasy peace, and ruled by a monarchy determined to allow no rivals, political, religious, or personal. And it was into this world that the next great scandal would erupt. A small provincial town named Loudun, where whispers of demons would draw crowds. A charismatic priest, Aubin Grandier, who defied authority. A tormented nun, Jeanne d'Ang, whose visions would shake the kingdom. And a church and state all too ready to crush anyone who threatened their power. The fires of the French wars of religion had cooled, but the embers still glowed hot beneath the surface, ready at any moment to ignite again.